Some people wonder, how do I get out of this? The tension, the pace, the way it seems at times so artificial. In recent years, one of the answers has been to start a new community. Communes and other kinds of experimental communities have been founded all across the country. Nearly everyone has thought about what an ideal world would be like, but few people have actually tried to put their thoughts to work, tried to create a community according to their ideas. Experimental communities are not new. This village is called Arden. It was founded in 1900 for many of the same reasons that people are starting communes today. Take a look at Arden, and you get an idea of what can happen when you plan and create a village. You can see the successes and failures, the problems that are solved, and the new tensions that are born. How does a village like Arden get its start? People can get together and plan a village on their own, or they can be part of a philosophical movement. The people who founded Arden were dedicated to an economic philosophy called the single tax.
Arden has its origins in the late 1800s when a newspaperman named Henry George tried to understand why there was such desperate poverty in the midst of great and prosperous cities. He came to think that poverty results from the unfair use of the land and unreasonable taxes. Now, if you tax the fruit of a man's labor, he won't work as hard, and he'll produce less. But if you tax the land, there won't be less land. He developed a theory in which a single tax on the value of the land would replace all other taxes. The single tax theory became so popular that the single taxes decided they had to have a place to try out their experiment and theory. And it had to be between near New York or somewhere near Philadelphia, because that's where most of the leading single taxers lived. So they looked around and they selected the little state of Delaware with its 3 counties and a population of about 125,000. In the Delaware elections of 1896, a band of single taxers campaigned up and down the state. They brought their knapsacks and leaflets and lectured to any audience they could find, and were finally arrested in Dover. Depraved and irresponsible vagabonds, they were called. Pests of society. For single taxers, the elections were a disaster. They got less than 3% of the vote. Now, one of the single taxers was Will Price, an architect. Another was a sculptor named Frank Stevens. And they decided that if they couldn't get a whole state to go single tax, why, they would start their own single tax village. For $9,000, they bought an old farm 6 miles north of Wilmington, Delaware. They put up $2,500 of their own money and borrowed the balance from millionaire Joe Fells of Fells Naphtha Soap. Fells supported single tax projects all over the country. They made Arden a trust with 3 trustees controlling the land. Anyone who lives in Arden leases his land for 99 years and pays rent to the trustees, who use the money to meet expenses. One of the early settlers in Arden was Scott Nearing, who was an economic professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Scott and his wife Helen now live on a farm in Maine and have worked out their own kind of independent, self-sufficient household economy.
Well, I went to Arden in the first instance because a local Arden resident named Fred Whiteside was renting a piece of land there, and he wanted somebody to go with him who could do a little surveying. And I could do a little surveying, so I went down with him over the weekend. And I found that there was a nice swimming hole and a nice group of crafty people, crafts people, and a very nice social atmosphere, and also a very tolerant ideological atmosphere. Because at Arden there were socialists and single taxers and anarchists and all kinds of people, and also conservatives who had no ideas at all. So, under the circumstances, I found that I could rent a piece of land, half an acre of land, for $13 a year. So I immediately put down $13 and rented a half an acre on the corner of the common. That was my first introduction to Arden, and I stayed there off and on for about 10 years. At that time, most of the people in Arden were what the economists would call lower middle class. They were not well-to-do people, they were not affluent people, they were not poverty-stricken. But they were poor enough and craft-minded enough so that they were willing and anxious to build their own houses and make repairs and do a lot of the work around the place themselves. In fact, one of the attractive things about Arden was that you could take care of your own place without losing caste.
In the early years, the people of Arden were very exuberant about their village and the influence it was going to have. They were sure that it would spread throughout the nation and maybe even in the world. There were a few single tax colonies springing up. The first one was in a place called Fairhope, Alabama. Arden was really the second one. But the single taxers in Arden were sure that the world would soon recognize that the single tax principle was the only sound economic system. From the beginning, Arden was more than an economic experiment. It was an attempt to fashion a richer, calmer, more beautiful existence. When Frank Stevens and Will Price first started dividing the land for housing plots, they set aside about half the land, the greens and the woodland, for community use. At first, Arden was principally a summer community. People lived here in the summer and commuted to their jobs in Philadelphia or Wilmington. Some lived in tents. And then they had a house built for them or built one themselves. The houses all had names. Rest Cottage, the Old Homestead, the New Homestead, a kind of savings and loan association was formed called the Raiffeisen Guild. It used to run an ad that went like this, quote, "The Raiffeisen Guild is a credit union of neighbors and homeowners which lends to men and women on reputation for honesty and neighborliness without other security or collateral. A safe investment paying 6%, which is used to bring people from city life to village life, to build homes, to foster handcraft, to bring about closer, stronger, and better social relations, and to make living simpler, quieter, and more beautiful. Why not help by taking some of your money out of its present investment, where it strengthens monopoly and government extravagance, and put it to work toward industrial freedom, individual enterprise, the development of art, and the bettering of the world in which our children must live," end quote.
If people go to the trouble of starting a community, it is because they have strong feelings about how life should be lived. How should people spend their time? What kind of work should they do? What kinds of social activities are worth having? Arden's founders believed that art, drama, music, and crafts are not luxuries, but that they're an essential part of life. And this concept grew to have more of an impact on the village than the economic philosophy that gave birth to it.
Frank Stevens and Will Price both believed that for a rich and satisfying life, a person had to make things. useful and beautiful things. It was a belief in the importance of crafts. One of the first buildings in Arden was the Red House, where Frank started the Arden Forge. He also did his sculpture there. The Red House was later enlarged and called the Craft Shop. The forge, furniture shop, weaving shop, press, and many other crafts flourished in this building. There was a craftsman's guild. In a pamphlet describing their crafts, they wrote, "The Arden craftsmen are a company of men and women who believe with the great English craftsman and prophet William Morris that all men should have work to do which shall be worth doing and be of itself pleasant to do, and which should be done under such conditions as would make it neither over wearisome nor over anxious." They believe also with Ruskin that men need not be baited into a shop like moths into a candle, and that there are those who will buy what is useful without being ill-designed and dishonestly made, even though its cost is more than that of factory goods. They therefore refuse to work in factory and city shop under a system which compels the maximum of hurry and the minimum of honesty, and have built up a craft shop in the open, in the country village of Arden, where their work, some finished and some in the making, may be seen and bought. There were hand-colored greeting cards printed on the Robert Studio Press. Stained glass by Alexander Bauer and Eleanor Darling. A weaving shop that made expensive wool dresses. In its prime, it employed as many as 25 or 30 people. The business finally grew too large for the craft shop and moved across the way to its own building. Fred Steinlein and Don Stevens, who was Frank Stevens' son, printed the Arden Leaves, a magazine about Arden affairs. Later, Buzz Ware put it out. Don Stevens had a furniture shop where he made chairs and tables in an English style. Many of the pieces were made from drawings by Will Price. When the Depression came, it was harder to make a living from these crafts. The craftsmen began looking for other work, and the craft shop finally closed down in 1936. The building still stands, but it's an apartment house, although many people still call it the craft shop. The tradition of arts and crafts remain, however, and there are a number of artists and craftsmen living in Arden today. Marcus Aurelius Renzetti is one.
This is closer to being maybe a pebble-like ovoid. You can tell a person about an ovoid, egg-like, but you'd have to do an awful lot of explaining what that looks like. Now, to a child, that may look like a man. Why? Eye socket, eye, and mouth. Now, children will go for that. They think, gee, that's funny. Then they may do this, put some hair over it. And then putting hair over it, they think they have to make... Now, this is comical or funny. They say, well, let's put a nose and do that. Now, this is in a funny area. Humor, if you like. Now, the same piece of clay is still useful. Some of us ought to try it at home. Get a piece of clay and put it in your hand in this manner and squeeze it as hard as you can. Make what you might say a handprint of it. And I'll guarantee you that you have made a personal piece of sculpture. Now let's look at this as it turns. What is it? It's an interesting piece of clay. It has imprints of many parts of your hand. If you like, you can turn that into maybe a human being. Lean that head forward, and then here it may look like a nun or a woman that has a garment, and that will be a little face. Keep it from being too ridiculous. A face, unlike E.T., wonder where that music is coming from.
and this could be a place for a hand.
Bunny Herlong. Charles Vinson. Ed Loper. Frank Donovan. I'm Miriam Hetzel Donovan.
That's all. You're doing fine. Take your places for Act Two.
Dramatic productions have been a tradition in Arden since the beginning. Arden has become one of the local centers for amateur actors. Productions like this Gilbert and Sullivan operetta involve more people from the surrounding suburbs than from Arden itself. There was a time when the plays were a community activity, with practically everyone taking part.
People often ask me, why did they put on so many plays in Arden, Shakespeare and all that kind of stuff? Well, you'll understand that in the first decade or the first 2 decades of the century, there are a lot of things that we didn't have then that we have now. TV hadn't been invented. The radio was just barely coming in, and it was very poor quality. And here in Arden, we didn't have many automobiles either in those days. Couldn't go anyplace except by train. So we had to make our own recreation. And everybody was busy. Everybody did something in town. And Shakespearean plays were one of the first things that were introduced. The single taxers were instrumental in getting that going. They wanted to do these plays to give themselves voice culture so they could be good speakers. It was funny. The town might be divided into 2 halves, and one half of it would be on the stage during the play, and the other half would be in the audience. The next week it'd be reversed.
Frank's first idea when he came to Arden was to build an outdoor theater. And it's still there with a big rock. We used to play Shakespeare every Saturday night. Frank was long on Julius Caesar. He liked to play Julius Caesar. I came along and I liked to play Midsummer Night's Dream. And of course, I'd always been interested in the theater because my mother was an actress and she played Shakespeare. Frank would take 1 week and I'd take another. So we had a week in between. I'd play bigger parts 1 week, and then the next week I'd be something small. I'd take a small part. Didn't have to study too much. We get all the people in the town, to get in these plays. We gave Merchant of Venice and Twelfth Night, and As You Like It, and we played Hamlet many times. We didn't have a lot of lights. We had, in the very beginning, we just had to use Japanese lanterns strung across the way. And then we got some sort of electric light that we clamped in on from those 2 posts. And that's all you need. But if you were on the stage and you forgot your line, would be a bunch of kids down in front, and they would know the line, and they'd shoot it at you or shoot you something else. Now, our kids, when they got to high school or any school, they knew all the plays. The people thought they were wonderful. We gave Alice in Wonderland, took it up to Philadelphia and played up there with them. We played over at Grenoble.
There's been a lot of music in Arden over the years. This is the Arden Consort. They play at some of the Arden activities and also at other events in the area. Way back in the older days, we used to have these Vespers at the Arden Guild Hall instead of like a Sunday service. It was late in the afternoon, and Frank Stevens would arrange to have musicals at the Guild Hall. Nobody said anything, but they just have serious music, and many of the men from the Philadelphia Orchestra used to come down, and they'd put on an evening or a late afternoon of music. Near the end of the summer every year, around Labor Day, we'd have these festivals, and people would learn songs for these, or for whatever the event was. But one was a Russian night. Then there was a night in Venice, which my father organized, and all summer he trained the young people to sing these Italian songs, like Stretti, Stretti, nella Stasi d'amore, and a lot of the old Italian songs. They didn't know what they meant, and none of them spoke Italian. Some of them were quite risque, but they learned them. The Arden Fair is a yearly tradition that is organized by the Arden Club. The club was formed in 1908 and is composed of various guilds. This is the Folk Guild, which sponsors a night of folk and square dancing every week. People who have a common interest can form a guild and have free use of this clubhouse and theater called the Guild Hall. The hall was originally a barn and was converted into a clubhouse in the early days of the village.
And there was an old barn down there, and a spring house, and an old mucky meadow. Frank got the idea that it'd be nice to have a guild hall. And we cleared out the barn. Well, it was quite a job.
Some people came with carpenter's tools and other similar equipment. People who were not able to do that kind of manual work came with their mandolins and banjos, and other people who were otherwise equipped provided something to drink and something to eat. And the whole town turned out, took the dirt out of the old barn, took a lot of the installations out of the old barn, a lot of the interior installations, and laid the basis for a clubhouse, a dance floor, an auditorium, and other aspects of a modern clubhouse.
One of the guilds that is popular now is the Dinner Guild. A community dinner is served every Saturday night on the lower floor of the Guild Hall. The dinner is prepared by a different group each week. ACRA stands for the Arden Community Recreation Association. It runs a children's program every summer and sponsors various affairs throughout the year. ACRA raises money with a fund drive in the spring, and then the events that it sponsors are free of charge.
Any place where people live has a character, a kind of personality. Sometimes that personality is the result of a dedicated group of people working together. Sometimes a single person has more to do with it than any group. Frank Stevens was one of Arden's founders, and he shaped practically every facet of Arden life. But when one person is strong enough and talented enough to shape an entire community, he is often a source of friction as well.
Frank Stevens was an artist and propagandist who had many ideas in the art field, in the political field, in the sociological field. He was a person who just threw off ideas the way a hot piece of hot iron throws off sparks. And of course, as the single taxable majority became a minority, Frank found himself in a minoritarian position again and again. And if he could work out a pattern of having his way, he worked it out. He wasn't a bureaucrat, but he was definitely an autocrat. Well, Frank was a thoroughly extraordinary fellow, there's no question about it. He could divide himself up in one day into 14 different pieces and take care of drama and business affairs and whatnot, hour after hour. And there's no question, but he was devoting his energies to something in which he believed. And he believed in it because he thought that following these lines, these Henry George lines, the world would be a better place to live in. There's no question about his attitude. In many ways, he was disappointed by what happened in Arden, by the failure of some of his craft schemes, by the rapid growth of the industrial complex, Wilmington, Chester, Baltimore, Philadelphia, that great area which became increasingly industrialized and farther and farther away from the kind of medieval economy that existed in Europe in the late feudal period. So Frank, in a sense, was disappointed by what happened in Arden. But being a very activist kind of person, he jumped in with both feet and did the best he could.
I decided it'd be a nice thing to give Alice in Wonderland. And I came down to the Birds end of it. And I went to Frank, and he was an awful busy man that day. And I said, listen, Frank, I'm stumped. I said, how in the devil do I make birds' heads without having to go and make a whole mask? And he said, wait a minute, I'll tell you. So we went around town, he gathered up all the derby hats he could find. And he made me the most beautiful set of animal heads you ever saw. All busy as he was. He was not too busy to bother with little things for people. And he was as good as gold, really was fine. And but a lot of people disliked him, and a lot of people were nasty to him. And I never could understand it. There was a group of people in this town who decided that whenever Frank got up and made a motion about something or wanted something done, they would vote him down. And I know that. And I know that's to be true. And I think it broke his heart, really, in many ways. They didn't realize that what that man went through. I'm going to stick up for Frank. He was no angel, but he was the soul of this town. And I wanted known he was the soul of this town.
You know, Frank Stevens was a kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I guess. He could be the sweetest person you ever want to know. He would do anything for you, do you all kinds of favors. If you came to Arden as a stranger to live here, he would take you under his wing and find out what your talents were and what you were interested in, you know, and see that you got busy in things. Right away, he got me into a Shakespeare play, and he did me all kinds of favors. He found me a house that I could rent for $25 a month, furnished and all. And then later on, he gave up his own studio. You see, he was a sculptor, and he had a studio on the second floor of the building that he owned called the Craft Shop, where they did all kinds of crafts. But he let me move into there and use this studio as my photographic studio. You see, at that time, I was a professional photographer. So I was using that studio. I had living quarters there and a dark room and all that. And I guess I was there about 2 years. But anytime Frank Stevens befriended anybody, why, he demanded loyalty from them too, you know. And if anybody voted against him in town meeting, why, it was pretty bad for him. If he had any way of punishing them, he would. So it came up one time he punished me because we were having some kind of a fracas in town meeting, and he had a project that he was interested in, and I didn't see it that way, and I quite frankly voted no. And, well, he always demanded that people hold up their hands, you know, and he could look around and see who his enemies were. And he saw that I had voted no on his proposition that he had presented there, and the next morning on my desk I found a little note saying that I should vacate the quarters just as soon as I could. I think he was quite an impractical man, too. When it came to financing and so forth, he let himself be carried away sometimes into big projects that he just couldn't make go. I mean, he would get into something that required an awful lot of money, and he'd only have a shoestring, just a few $100s to start a new colony or something like that. I think anybody with any realistic monetary knowledge at all would never have gone in for a project of that size. It was just too big for him.
Frank Stevens, who was known to his friends as Patro, which means father in Esperanto, designed many of the homes in Arden. He started the Arden Forge. He taught wood carving. He was a sculptor. He organized the Shakespearean plays in the Field Theater, which were given every Saturday night in the summertime. He generated all the enthusiasm for the outdoor pageants and for every activity in Arden. But by 1923, he said that Arden had become material instead of spiritual, and many of the projects in which he was interested were dropped because of apathy, outright hostility, or because people just didn't see the things the way he saw them. They said he was impractical. They said he was a dreamer. But the paradox is that this dreamer, this impractical man, this utopian, had created the village in which they live.
How can a unique village keep from becoming more and more like the culture around it? As a community grows, new people move in who don't have the same fundamental ideas as the founders. The new people want to change things, while the founders struggle to maintain the original character and vision. This kind of struggle puts a terrific strain on the community.
Some of those in the back, if they would move up and fill up some of the seats up in the front here.
Community decisions are made at the town meeting. Since Arden was incorporated in 1967, the meeting has had all the power any municipal government in Delaware can have. Since the incorporation, the trustees have been happy to have the town assembly make decisions and run the town. It wasn't always this way. Years ago, there was a great deal of friction between the trustees and the town meeting and between various factions in the village. Some of these disputes grew into passionate arguments that caused bad feelings still felt 20 or 30 years later. Arden was founded as an experiment in single tax, but almost from the beginning a number of socialists moved in, and so did people who were neither single taxers nor socialists. There was a built-in conflict between these groups. On the one hand, there were the trustees who held power and could veto practically any decision of the town meeting. The trustees were obligated by the deed of trust to follow the single tax philosophy. On the other hand, the majority of the residents of the village knew almost nothing about single tax and really cared less. They felt that the trustees frequently vetoed the wishes of the majority and that the whole situation was undemocratic. The conflict finally wound up in court.
A major dispute running for years was carried on between the leaseholders and the trustees as to who had the ultimate right to determine what the full rental value of the land was. The trustees said, we are the final arbiters of that. The leaseholders said, you can then be so arbitrary and so capricious that we will not be able to build homes. We must know from time to time that in some democratic way we have the right to assist in formulating the formula that will result in full rental value. And in 1935, this issue went to court. Chancellor Walcott decided that it was the assessors of Arden who were to establish the full rental value of the land and not the trustees of Arden. In In 1937, Edwin Ross, a trustee, died, and in order to fill the vacancy, the deed of trust required the remaining trustees to select someone who had to be approved by a majority of the residents of Arden. For a period from 1937 to 1942, there could be no agreement. Whomever the trustees selected, the residents wouldn't have. Whomever the residents suggested to the trustees would not select. The acrimony was at a fever pitch. It was simply a case of distrust. The leaseholders and residents of Arden simply did not trust the trustees. The trustees did not trust the residents. And basically it was whether the single tax was going to survive or not. So in 1942, a suit was brought by several residents of Arden in order to resolve this matter of a vacancy. And the Chancellor, realizing that these people were using his court as a forum for espousing their political beliefs, their social beliefs, their economic beliefs, everything but keeping to the point of selecting a third trustee, finally realized that he had to use his inherent power to appoint a trustee himself. One day I received a call from the Chancellor, and I went over to his chambers. He told me then that he was going to select me as the third trustee. I thanked him and was about to leave when he made what I think to be a classic statement. He said to me, "Cohen, keep them out of my court."
The land rent is still an issue today. Mike Curtis is a tree surgeon. He was elected chairman of the Board of Assessors. Their job is to assess the land rent on property in Arden. Mike is a dedicated single taxer, probably one of the few in Arden.
In Arden, we don't tax anybody on any of their improvements, which means if you want to build a $100,000 house, the taxes will be no more than if you had a $10,000 house. This has created, I suppose, a lot of jealousy in Arden, where people say a man with a big house and a small lot pays less taxes than a man with a small house and a big lot. And they're saying, hey, this is not right. But as a Georgist, we say, what is the man getting from the community? He's getting a lot of land. Well, he should pay the community for that. Through his own efforts, he's built a big house. Why should he owe other people money for that? Why should he pay a fine for his industry? And to me, it makes all the sense in the world. I think the way the single tax hasn't been followed in Arden is that we have a highly restrictive zoning code which pertains to our future development and our commerce. Now, we talk about the full rental value. Some people feel that it is being charged now, at least pretty nearly, but I think that very few people in Arden really understand what economic rent is or how it might be determined. I've been an assessor for 2 years now, and I've studied the annual value of Arden land, and I think we're collecting about half of it.
Many communities are selective in that only certain people are allowed to become members. Those accepted adhere to a certain philosophy or religion, or are members of a particular race or socioeconomic group. Arden took the opposite approach and never made any restrictions on who could live in the community.
Tolerance was the predominating theme in Arden. Let everybody in. As a matter of fact, there used to be a sign at the entrance to Arden which said, "Ye are welcome hither." There were just no restrictions. There are all kinds of people in Arden, all kinds of homes. There are large homes and small homes. There are fancy homes and homes just not so fancy. Arden had the first racially integrated public school in the state of Delaware. Arden was the first town in Delaware that permitted women to vote. As a matter of fact, young people were also permitted to vote, including children on occasions. Arden was a home for individualists, all the way from Mrs. Jean Worthington, who was the epitome of the mid-Victorian stately lady, all the way over to the left, to Mother Bloor, Ella Reeves Bloor. She was the outstanding women labor agitator of her times and was known until her death as the mother of the Communist Party in the United States.
I remember the first time I ever met Mother Bloor. It was really funny. It was in front of the Academy of Music. And there was a dray standing out in front of it, and Mother Bloor was on the end of it, talking in a loud tone of voice, delivering a speech. And then I found out that was going to be my mother-in-law. That was me. But, you know, I couldn't help it. I stood and listened to her. She had a very good speaking voice. She was well-trained, and she had a good audience. I never once was asked by Mother Bloor, nor was Buzz, nor any of us, to be a communist. Never. And we weren't. We didn't believe in communism. I'll start off that way. But I admired her very, very much because I like people that do their own thinking. And she could think for herself, and she did an awful lot of good. I remember her before she was a communist, before that was an impolite term or whatever kind of term you want to call it, when she was a socialist. And she started because she wanted to help people. And she was a lovely person, really lovely.
A long time ago, there was an article in the newspapers that said that the people in Arden roost in trees. Well, that was a popular rumor, and it got its start from Fred Whiteside, the congenial perennial candidate for governor on the socialist ticket.
Well, my father built a treehouse, which started quite a thing in the newspapers. They added to their other little bits of folklore about Arden that my father's treehouse was not just one treehouse in Arden, that people lived in trees. The other items that they had previously said was it was a free love colony, it was a nudist colony, and what you will. So now we were tree dwellers. And, well, it was very simple. Dad wanted not to be disturbed on Sunday mornings because he lived an awfully vigorous life. So the tree house was just for sleeping.
Some couples, a very small number, lived together in Arden without being married. But the flavor of the old days was quite puritanical compared to things that are generally accepted now. Now, as a result of these different lifestyles and philosophies, some people had a very, very strange idea and a notion about what Arden was like. There never was, for example, a nudist colony in Arden. But Ben Smolsky swore that there was.
They had a lot of people there. They sure had a lot of people out there in that nudist colony. Just don't know how many. This has been about 30 years ago now, or more. I was only a young boy then. They had a great baseball team. Holy cow, they beat us almost every time we played them. We only beat them but one time. Real good hitting team they had. Yeah, that was a real good hitting team they had. We'd get up around a fence once in a while. We'd sneak over after the ball game, and we used to see the people walking around, the nudist colony, the people walking around, and we were young and ornery, so...
No matter what a community does, it can't help but be affected by the changes going on in the world around it. A simple example is the increasing crime rate. In the old days, a burglary was material for a good story.
One morning about 2 a.m., I heard some pebbles being thrown against our screen on the second floor in the room where we were sleeping. And I got up and went to the window. There was just about enough light to see that there were two individuals down in the front yard trying to attract our attention. So I asked what was wanted and asked who they were. And one boy said, "I'm Buzz Ware," and the other fellow said, "I'm Guy Nearing. Someone is trying to rob Margaret Wood's silver working shop in the craft shop." Said, "Do you have any sort of weapons?" "Well," I said, "I have a baseball bat and a sickle. And I'm afraid that's about all." So they said, "Well, put your trousers on and come down and help us catch this burglar." So I got dressed and went down, got my weapons and took out to them. And Buzz says, "I play ball, so I'll use the bat." And the guy said, "Well, I'll take the sickle." I said, "Maybe you can cut his suspenders and tangle his feet." So we wandered on over to the craft shop and very silently crept up to the second floor where the silver shop was. And guy said, "I'll open this door very suddenly so that we don't give him any warning." So he opened the door and out rushed a tomcat with a very loud meow, pushed past, and Buzz says, "Quick, cut his suspenders." The guy says, "Oh, go on, let's go home to bed."
Young people have begun coming to Arden, congregating on the green and in the woods. Arden folk are divided in their feelings about them. Some think that the young people bring drugs and crime to Arden. They're afraid to walk outside at night. Others have no such fear. This is a meeting of the Cosmos Guild. These teenagers formed the guild to use Arden facilities and also to show that they wanted to contribute to the community.
Arden's been isolated for many years from all the other communities that are around Arden because there weren't any roads. And the crime rate in Arden was a lot lower. And the people never locked their doors, and nobody ever thought of having to worry about somebody robbing their house. But all this I-95 and Marsh Road and all these roads have been built and connected Arden with places that have had high crime rates all the time, and people just aren't used to the crime as it has been for years in the other communities. People have walked by the green, and we'll say hello to them, and they'll just look straight ahead and keep walking, and they won't say anything to it.
Not all of them.
No, some of them.
We have no contact with them really, except for rumors we hear if they get on a meeting. And we don't know them, they don't know us, and that's probably the main problem.
It's just, but, I don't think everybody in Arden's afraid to walk on the streets at night either. I think a smaller percentage of people are afraid to. And that percentage is probably the same people that just walk by and, they're not there.
Well, if we stood on the corner of another development or, in one of their small public parks, people would get, so freaked out, so paranoid over a gang of kids that, they'd have the cops down there in a minute. And we'd be in jail or, they'd want to know the reason why. If we told them we just gathered there to talk, I doubt they'd believe it. They think it was, a gang ready for a rumble or something like that. Some 1950 James Dean type thing. They always see a group of kids, And they just don't have the attitude to accept different people or other people the way the people in Arden do.
A community begins with a dream, a vision. But as time passes and lifestyles change, a vision can disintegrate. Frank Stevens and Will Price founded Arden at the turn of the century. How much is left of their vision? The answer depends on who you ask. These teenagers love Arden, although many of them don't even live here. They come here from the surrounding suburbs because Arden is different. It has a character and diversity they're looking for.
It's weird because you think your ideas are your own, And you talk to people in Arden, the older people, and they had the ideas before you, it's like in Arden development, if you walk around the woods, if older people walk around the woods, they go, something wrong with him, you know, he's having a weirdo. You know?
They know that you need a certain amount of land in order to keep your sanity, and Arden has that. They have forests for you to go into. Like, you just don't have your own yard. I think that makes for a community spirit. You have more than your own backyard. You have the greens, the forest, or the commons. You have everything to go to.
Sort of, it's different scenery here. It's green here. Things aren't the same everywhere you look. There's differences in the different houses, that sort of thing.
It's a sanctuary for people who like to think different, you know?
Yeah.
You can't, in most communities, you more or less are, you know, molded into what they want you to be. Well, in Arden, the whole, even the atmosphere, the environment, you know, is one of freedom.
Really, where else would, say, an older person really stop and talk with a young person? The way a lot of people in Arden seem to. They'll really stop and you can get into a really nice conversation with them.
Would you like to live here? Sure. Yeah, I'd like to live here, but like, there's other factors like the draft and things like that. You know, might have to leave the country or something like that. I mean, Arden's in the United States, so it has all the hang-ups that the United States has.
If I were to live here, I'd sort of keep the traditions going that Arden has right now. Say the different guilds they carry on, the Arden Fair that they keep every year, that sort of thing. The sort of their government seems to be shared by everyone in the community. I'd sort of like to keep that going.
Robert Foote is the great-grandson of Frank Stevens. He believes that Arden no longer has the vision of the early days, and that to recapture that vision, you have to begin again and start your own community.
Arden was a dream, it was a vision, it was something vital, something growing when it was first started. And this dream took roots and it grew and it bore fruit. And I think that the people today who are looking for a new dream or a new vision do so in the same spirit as those that first founded and nurtured Arden. And Arden is a nice place to live, but to me it doesn't seem to be growing anymore. And I think there's certain indications of this, certain places you can look. Like in the field of education now, a lot of people are questioning the basic premises of education, what it should be used for, and they're making new tries and free schools and experimental projects. And at a time when all this questioning and rediscovering is going on, the Arden School closes down. And I think it can be seen in things like the principles of single taxism, where a lot of books and magazine articles, even in places like Look and Life, are being written now about single taxism and about using it as a possible remedy for some of the economic ills that this country has. And at a time of questioning again like this, Arden seems largely unconscious of its basis in single taxism and what that really means. I think very few people are aware of what single taxism means to them and how it can be applied to the country at the present time. I think you can see it in the idea of a community. There are a lot of people that are making new experiments with community living, both in the young people that are going out either individually or in groups into communes to try a new living relationship. On the other extreme, you have a lot of the new architects that are devising these new anthill or beehive cities for the future that will house hundreds and thousands of people in a very tiny area. And these are very drastic changes in our living patterns, and at this time when all these thoughts are trying to be worked out, Arden again seems largely unconscious of its own heritage of community spirit. I think primarily people need a common ideal or a common dream, a common vision. And they need it individually, or they need it in marriages, they need it in communities or communes, they need it in nations. And I think you sort of have to go off the same way that Patro and Will Price found someplace in the deserted northern Delaware and bought an old farm and started their own thing. I think pretty much you have to do the same thing. I think it's very hard to grow new ideas within an old framework or an old environment. So I think Joyce and I are looking for in this van is just moving around a little bit, because there are a lot of exciting things happening, a lot of people trying different things, and so to look for people, to look for places, to look for land eventually, where we can try to find our own dream, our own vision inside ourselves.